At 12:21 a.m. on August 26, 1940, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring stood on the balcony of his hunting lodge at Hall, 50 miles north of Berlin, listening to sounds he had promised would never occur. Air raid sirens wailed across the German capital. British bombers were overhead. In September 1939, Göring had declared to his Luftwaffe, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Göring. You may call me Meyer." Now, enemy aircraft had reached not just the Ruhr, but Berlin itself, the heart of the Reich. The promise lay shattered. What Göring did not yet realize was that the fury of one man's reaction to this humiliation would alter the course of the entire war. Adolf Hitler was not in Berlin that night. He was nearly 700 miles to the southwest, at the Berghof, his mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps near Berchtesgaden. The phone call from Berlin came through at approximately 12:45 a.m. According to the diary of Major Engel, Hitler's army adjutant, the Führer's immediate response was silence. A long, dangerous silence. Then he demanded to speak with Göring directly. The Reichsmarschall was unreachable, having retreated to his private quarters. Hitler slammed down the receiver. In Engel's account, the words that followed were measured but venomous. So now they come to Berlin. The raid itself was modest by later standards. 95 aircraft of Royal Air Force Bomber Command had taken off from bases in eastern England shortly after 9:00 p.m. on August 25th, though only 81 actually dropped their bombs on or around Berlin. Their target folders, prepared at High Wycombe headquarters, listed industrial facilities on the outskirts of Berlin, the Tempelhof Gas Works, the Siemensstadt Electrical Works, and the Klingenberg Power Station. The actual damage was negligible. The bombs were widely dispersed due to cloud cover and navigation difficulties. Several bombs fell on residential areas in the districts of Kreuzberg and Wedding, but the psychological impact, particularly on one individual, would prove catastrophic for Germany. To understand the volcanic nature of Hitler's reaction, one must first understand the promise that had been broken. In the spring of 1940, following the stunning victories in Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, the German people viewed the Luftwaffe as invincible. Göring himself, promoted to the unique rank of Reichsmarschall on July 19th, cultivated this image relentlessly. The Luftwaffe had destroyed the Polish Air Force in 3 days. It had supported the Blitzkrieg through France with devastating efficiency. Now, in July and August of 1940, it was preparing to destroy the Royal Air Force as a prelude to Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. The strategic context had evolved rapidly through the summer. On July the 16th, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 16, which outlined the preliminary conditions for invasion. The English Air Force must have been beaten down to such an extent morally, and in fact that it can no longer muster any power of attack worth mentioning against the German crossing. Göring accepted this mission with supreme confidence. He commanded a force of approximately 2,800 aircraft, organized into 3 Luftflotten, or air fleets: Luftflotte II, under General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, Luftflotte III under General Feldmarschall Hugo Sperle, and Luftflotte V under General Oberst Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, stationed in Norway. The initial phase of what the British would call the Battle of Britain focused on shipping in the English Channel and coastal radar stations. Beginning August 13th, designated Adlertag or Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched concentrated attacks against RAF airfields and aircraft factories. The strategy, conceived by Göring and his operations staff, was methodical. Destroy fighter command on the ground and in the air. Establish air superiority, then support the invasion fleet. By mid-August, the campaign appeared to be succeeding. Fighter command was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Airfields across southeastern England, including Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, and North Weald, had been bombed repeatedly. Some were nearly inoperable. What changed this dynamic was a navigational error on the night of August 24th. A formation of German bombers, part of Kampfgeschwader 1, became disoriented over England. Their assigned targets were oil refineries at Thames Haven and aircraft factories near Rochester, both well outside the London city limits. Hitler had explicitly forbidden attacks on London itself, hoping to avoid escalation and preserve the option of a negotiated peace. But in the confusion and darkness, several crews from the Lost Formation dropped their bombs on the east end of London. The damage was limited. 9 civilians died in Bethnal Green and Stepney, but the political consequences would be immense. Prime Minister Winston Churchill seized the opportunity immediately. At a meeting of the War Cabinet on the morning of August 25th, Churchill argued forcefully for retaliation. Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal, Chief of Bomber Command, presented plans for a strike on Berlin. Some cabinet members expressed concern about escalation, but Churchill was adamant. As he later wrote in his war memoirs, the first strike at the heart of Germany would have a profound psychological effect. That evening, 81 bombers took off for Berlin. The die was cast. Hitler received detailed reports of the Berlin raid throughout the morning of August 26th. By noon, he had summoned his closest advisors to the Berghof: Martin Bormann, head of the Nazi Party Chancellery; Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht; and Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff. According to Jodl's operational diary, Hitler spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting in a controlled rage, pacing the great hall with his hands clasped behind his back. The word he repeated most often was Vergeltung, revenge. Hitler's fury had multiple sources. There was the personal humiliation. The British had violated German airspace, reached the capital, and exposed Göring's boast as hollow. There was ideological outrage. The British, in Hitler's view, were supposed to recognize German superiority and accept a negotiated peace. Instead, they had struck at the symbolic heart of the Reich. And there was the political dimension. Hitler had carefully constructed an image of Germany as invincible. The population had endured rationing and mobilization with remarkable patience, sustained by the narrative of inevitable victory. Now, air raid sirens in Berlin undermined that narrative. But beneath the tactical considerations lay something more primal. Hitler took the raid personally. In his mind, Berlin was not merely the capital of Germany. It was his capital, the city he had transformed with grandiose architectural projects and mammoth rallies. The British bombs were not attacking industrial targets. They were attacking him. According to Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect, who was present at the Berghof that afternoon, the Führer seemed less concerned with the military implications than with what he perceived as a personal insult. He spoke repeatedly of Churchill, almost as if the Prime Minister had personally piloted the bombers. The British struck Berlin again on the night of August 28th. This time, 170 aircraft participated. They hit the Siemens works at Siemensstadt more accurately, and several bombs struck near the Reichstag building in the government quarter. 10 civilians died. Hitler, still at the Berghof, received the news at breakfast. Witnesses reported that he threw his napkin on the table and left the room without speaking. When he returned 20 minutes later, he had made his decision. On September 4th, 1940, Hitler traveled to Berlin to speak at a mass rally in the Sportpalast, the cavernous indoor arena in the Schöneberg district that had hosted many Nazi spectacles. The event had been scheduled weeks earlier as a celebration of the victories in Poland and France, marking the opening of the annual Winter Relief Campaign. Now it would serve a different purpose. Approximately 10,000 party officials, Wehrmacht officers, nurses, munitions workers, and carefully selected civilians filled the hall. Göring sat prominently on the stage, visibly uncomfortable. The speech began at 6 p.m. Hitler opened with a review of the campaign in the West, emphasizing the speed of victory and the cowardice of the French. The audience applauded mechanically. Then, approximately 40 minutes into the address, his tone shifted. His voice rose. The subject changed to Britain. In the speech's most infamous passage, Hitler said, "When they declare that they will increase their attacks on our cities, then we will raze their cities to the ground." The hall erupted. The applause lasted nearly 3 minutes. Hitler waited for silence, then continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "When the British Air Force drops 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 kilograms of bombs, then we will in one night drop 150, 230, 300 or 400,000 kilograms." Another wave of applause crashed through the hall. Then came the passage that sealed the fate of the Luftwaffe's strategic campaign. "We will stop the handiwork of these night air pirates, so help us God. The hour will come when one of us will break, and it will not be National Socialist Germany." The audience rose to its feet, roaring approval. But several military officers present later reported their dismay. General Oberst Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary that evening, "The decision has been made for political reasons, not military ones." The immediate military consequence of Hitler's September 4th speech was Führer Directive No. 17, issued on September 7th. The relevant passage read, "Attacks on the English homeland are to be carried out against the City of London." That afternoon, at 4 p.m., 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, appeared over the Thames estuary and proceeded up the river toward London. The Blitz had begun. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers would strike London. Between September 7th and November 3rd, the Luftwaffe would drop approximately 13,000 tons of high explosive and nearly 1 million incendiary bombs on the British capital. But this shift in targeting had a consequence that Hitler either did not anticipate or chose to ignore. Fighter Command's battered airfields in southeastern England received a reprieve. The pressure that had brought the RAF to the edge of collapse in late August suddenly lifted. New pilots arrived from training schools. Damaged aircraft were repaired. Cratered runways were filled. The breathing space was measured in days, but those days proved decisive. Göring himself recognized the strategic error almost immediately. At a conference with his Luftflotte commanders on September 14th at The Hague, he argued obliquely for returning to attacks on RAF infrastructure. According to the minutes kept by Oberst Josef Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, Göring said, "The destruction of the enemy air force remains the primary objective." But he could not directly contradict Hitler's explicit order. Kesselring, commanding Luftflotte II, was more blunt. In his post-war memoir, he wrote, "The abandonment of attacks on airfields was our greatest mistake. The British fighter force, which was on the verge of collapse, was given time to recover." The relationship between Hitler and Göring deteriorated rapidly through September. The Reichsmarschall, accustomed to unlimited favor, now found himself summoned repeatedly to justify Luftwaffe performance. The losses were mounting. On September 15th, later commemorated by the British as Battle of Britain Day, the Luftwaffe launched 2 massive daylight raids on London. The RAF, now recovered and reinforced, met them with ferocious resistance. The Luftwaffe lost 60 aircraft. Fighter Command lost 26. The ratio was unsustainable. Even the inflated German victory claims could not disguise the reality. Air superiority over England was not being achieved. Hitler blamed Göring. Göring blamed his subordinates. Kesselring and Sperle blamed inadequate intelligence. Oberst Schmid's intelligence staff had consistently underestimated RAF strength, at one point in late August claiming Fighter Command was down to its last 100 operational aircraft, when the actual figure was closer to 700. The recriminations spiraled. Meanwhile, The strategic window for Operation Sea Lion was closing. The autumn weather in the English Channel was deteriorating. Naval commanders reported that without air superiority, a cross-channel invasion would be suicidal. On September 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The official justification, outlined in a memorandum from Jodl, cited inadequate naval preparation and unfavorable weather forecasts. But the real reason was the failure to destroy the RAF. And the failure to destroy the RAF stemmed directly from the decision, made in Führer on August 26th and formalized on September 4th, to shift from attacking airfields to attacking cities. The irony was not lost on British leadership. Churchill, informed of the shift in German targeting on September 7th, understood immediately what it meant. According to Sir John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, the Prime Minister said that evening at Chequers, his country estate, "They have made a terrible mistake." Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, was more succinct. When asked later what had saved Britain, he replied, "Hitler's decision to bomb London." The human cost of Hitler's rage was borne by British civilians. Between September 7th and November 3rd, approximately 15,000 Londoners were killed and 20,000 seriously wounded. The East End, with its dense working-class neighborhoods and proximity to the docks, suffered disproportionately. On the night of September 7th alone, 430 civilians died. The bombers returned night after night. Entire streets were obliterated. St. Paul's Cathedral, surrounded by flame and smoke, became a symbol of defiance. The destruction was documented in thousands of photographs, many of which were immediately published to steel British morale and attract American sympathy. But from a purely military perspective, the Blitz failed to achieve its strategic objective. British war production continued. The RAF grew stronger. The Royal Navy maintained control of the Sowed Channel, and most critically, the British government showed no inclination toward negotiations. Hitler had gambled that terror bombing would break civilian morale and force Churchill to the bargaining table. The gamble failed. British civilian morale, supported by effective civil defense, air raid shelters, and a pervasive propaganda campaign emphasizing national unity, proved far more resilient than German intelligence had predicted. By late October, Hitler's attention was shifting eastward. Preliminary planning for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was already underway. The Battle of Britain, from Hitler's perspective, had become a sideshow. Daylight raids against England largely ceased after October 31st, when a final attack on London cost the Luftwaffe 41 aircraft. Night bombing continued through the winter and spring of 1941, but with decreasing intensity. The last major raid on London occurred on May 10, 1941. After that, Luftwaffe units began transferring to the east in preparation for the attack on the Soviet Union, scheduled for June. Göring never recovered his standing with Hitler. The promise that Berlin would never be bombed had been broken in the most public way possible. The Luftwaffe's failure to destroy the RAF or force Britain to surrender compounded the humiliation. Hitler increasingly bypassed Göring on military matters, consulting directly with field commanders or relying on other advisors. The Reichsmarschall retreated into a fog of morphine addiction and art collecting, maintaining his titles and privileges, but exercising diminishing real authority. The officers who had recognized the strategic error at the time were vindicated by history, though few lived to see that vindication. Kesselring, captured in 1945, told his British interrogators, "If we had continued attacking your airfields for another 2 weeks, we would have won." Post-war analysis by the RAF largely concurred. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded No. 11 Group during the battle, stated in a 1947 lecture, "The German change from airfield attacks to city attacks was the critical turning point. The ultimate irony is that Hitler's emotional decision, born of wounded pride and personal rage, may have saved the nation he sought to destroy." Britain given time to rebuild fighter command, survived the summer of 1940. That survival enabled Britain to serve as a base for the eventual liberation of Western Europe. The bombers that would later devastate German cities, including Berlin, flew from British airfields. The armies that landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, assembled in Britain. The entire Allied strategy in the West depended on the survival of Britain as an independent nation and forward operating base. In the summer of 1945, when British and American forces occupied Berlin, they found the city in ruins. The destruction dwarfed anything inflicted in 1940. Over 360 major air raids had struck the German capital between 1943 and 1945. Approximately 50,000 Berliners had died. Much of the government quarter, the symbolic heart that Hitler had sought to protect in August 1940, was rubble. The Reichstag, near which British bombs had fallen on August 28, 1940, was a burned-out shell. The supreme irony was clear. Hitler's decision to avenge the first minor raids on Berlin had set in motion the chain of events that led to Berlin's total destruction. Churchill, visiting the ruins of Berlin in July 1945, was shown the remains of the Reichstag by his British military escort. According to contemporaneous accounts, he stood silently for several minutes, then remarked, "They sowed the wind." The biblical reference was to Hosea 8:7, "For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind." It was an epitaph for a city, and for a decision made in rage on an August morning 5 years earlier. Hitler's reaction to the bombing of Berlin stands as one of World War II's most consequential errors of judgment. A leader who prided himself on will and decisiveness allowed emotion to override strategy. Göring, desperate to deflect blame and recover favor, never seriously challenged the decision. The German military leadership, accustomed to the Führer's tirades, lacked the institutional power or personal courage to object. And the British, recognizing the gift they had been given, exploited it ruthlessly. The photograph taken in the Sportpalast on September 4, 1940, now held in the German Federal Archives in Berlin, captures the moment. Hitler stands at the podium, mouth open, arm raised, face contorted with fury. Behind him sits Göring, staring at his hands. The image freezes a turning point. In that hall, on that afternoon, the outcome of the Battle of Britain was decided, not by superior aircraft or brilliant tactics, but by one man's inability to separate personal rage from strategic necessity. The British bombs that fell on Berlin in August 1940 caused minimal physical damage, but they triggered a reaction that changed the course of history.